Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wassalamu ala sayyidil mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Subhanaka la fahma la ilma fahamtana innaka antal jawadul karim. Qul rabbi zidni ilma. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Amma ba'd. So alhamdulillah, now we've reached to the 15th halaqah. There is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and again we're not getting there. Why is this not? Wait. What did you do?
So this is your second monitor. So imagine there's a monitor here, which is this one. So you need to move over your mouse to the other side. Just move over here. So you'll see the mouse coming onto this side. And you click inside it. And now your focus is on this monitor. And then you can play on it.
Okay, sorry folks who are online. We're just, these old people like me have to learn these new gadgets, it's not easy. So Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So alhamdulillah, now we have reached to the point in time when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is now in his 30s. Okay, previously it was around 20s, and now Rasulullah has reached in his 30s. And we mentioned last time, maybe we mentioned this or not, but of course during that era, all of the children of Rasulullah were born. Okay, from Sayyidah Khadija radiallahu anha, of course, with the exception of Ibrahim alayhi salam, who was, of course, came later in Medina. We'll talk about him later. Al-Qasim, who lived only a few years and passed away, and obviously Nabi alayhi salam is known as Abul Qasim, and therefore, as in the Arabic tradition, anyone who has reached, the age of maturity, so he's married and he has a position in society, it would be kind of lowly to call him by his name. So this is still prevalent in Arab tradition, and particularly in some of our Arab more traditional Arab cultures. They were always called elder men by their kunya. No. And
Oh, your idol.
Why does it do it?
You're still on.
Huh?
You're still on.
Yeah, but why did it go off? Okay, Bismillah. So, yes, as we said, so Sayyidina Rasulullah was known as Abu Qasim. And we'll note that in Medina Munawwara particularly, even when everyone else is calling Rasulullah, so the Jews, the Jewish rabbis and others would address Rasulullah as Abu Qasim. They would never say Rasulullah because they didn't believe he was the Prophet. But they would always address him, Ya Abu Qasim, and Ya Abu Qasim, this or that. Okay? And then, certain books mention 3 different individuals, Abdullah, Tahir, and Tayyib, but actually the tahqiq is, or in verification, actually, Tahir and Tayyib were 2 what we call laqabs, or sort of nicknames, if you will, for Abdullah, and that was the name of the second son of Rasulullah, who also passed away while he was weaning. He didn't even reach the the full 2 years. And then Zainab, and then the four daughters of Rasulullah, Zainab, Ruqayya, Kulthum, and Fatima, and all of them, of course, accepted Islam, and all of them migrated with Rasulullah, and of course, Zainab had a very horrendous affair, which ultimately led to her untimely death in Medina Munawwara. Otherwise, they all performed, they all accepted Islam early on, and they all performed hijrah with Rasul, migrated with Rasul, and they all, with the exception of Fatima, also passed away.
Can you log in, please?
Huh?
Can you log in? It's logging you out because of the idle time. I think it's less than 2 minutes.
Yes, okay. We can do it.
Oh, this will be on screen, but I don't know. Close it. Can you search for timeout? Click on here, please.
No, this is it. And plugged in, turn off after 2 hours. Sleep. This is what it was. It's actually called sleep in this one. Okay, hopefully we won't have this problem. Okay. Carrying on. So the four daughters of Rasulullah, whom they all passed away in Medina, with the exception of Fatima, who also passed away after Rasulullah 6 months after his demise.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are the children in order right now?
Yeah, exactly. That's the order that they were born in. Okay, extended family. Now this is also another interesting thing, that Abu Talib, as we mentioned earlier, he was, although he was having and enjoying a very high status in terms of his nobility and stature and status in the tribe of Quraysh, however, financially he was quite strained. And so he was struggling to support his very large family. So as a result of that, Rasulullah came up with a suggestion that actually, and by that time, Rasulullah had married and with Khadija, now they were quite prosperous. And also Sayyidina Abbas, his uncle, was also similar in age of Rasulullah. So the two of them decided that we will basically kind of adopt two of the sons of Abu Talib. So Abbas, there's something happening here.
It's the screen timeout.
Chef, keep moving is
Yeah.
the cursor. Yeah.
I can change that. When we,
So, that's the screen. That's supposed to, it says to sleep, right?
no, that's a different one. So it's
Okay, anyway, we'll just keep doing this. So you don't bother about it. Let's keep on. Okay, so Sayyidina Abbas who took responsibility of Sayyidina Ja'far, who was approximately 15 years old around that time, was the elder of the brothers. And then Rasulullah adopts Sayyidina Ali. So this also, not only he's his cousin, but also he actually grows up more or less like the son of Rasulullah. So that very, inseparable connection and relationship that, Sayyidina Ali enjoyed with Rasulullah from the very beginning, from Jahiliyyah to Islam. And so he was not only his cousin, but he was also basically like one of the household. And it's also interesting that he grows up with his wife to be also, right? Very interesting. Okay, Zayd also, as we talked about Zayd, if you remember in the last halaqah, we talked about Zayd, who was actually belonged to Khadija, and she gave as a gift to Rasulullah, and Rasulullah emancipated him and gave him the option to go back with his father, who found out that he was actually in Makkah. His father came, if you remember, And Rasulullah said, "You're free to go with your father if you so please." But he so didn't please, and he pleased to remain with Rasulullah, and thereupon Rasulullah actually adopted him as his son, which later on in Islam it forbid that, and that's going to come later on. But otherwise, until that period of time, he was known as Zayd ibn Muhammad. So obviously, he's one of the household as well. And last but not least, Baraka Sayyidah Ayman radiallahu anha, who Rasulullah inherited from his father, who she was the slave and servant of his father, and she was quite young at the time of his father's death. In any case, she was, of course, older than Zayd, who ultimately married her. So Zayd ultimately married Baraka. And again, very interestingly, they were all of one household. They married. And of course, from that marriage came Sayyidina Usama, anhu, whose name is quite famous and infamous, right? And Usama radiallahu anhu, he and his father both were among the most beloved to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Sayyidina Usama radiallahu anhu, one of the things that Rasulullah mentioned, that he was khaliq lil-imara. He was created, and his character was built, to take responsibility and be the emir, of the armed forces. Okay. Also, Nabi Sallallahu had very close friends and allies later on among his close relatives. And if you remember, Abdul Muttalib, among his sons, and his eldest son was Harith ibn Abdul Muttalib, who was obviously the brother of the father of Rasulullah, Abdullah, right? So his son Sufyan ibn al-Harith, don't confuse him with Sufyan ibn Harb, who became, the chief adversary of Rasulullah, So Sufyan ibn Harith was, you can say something like the cousin of Rasulullah. And he was, a very close friend of Rasulullah in childhood and remained aligned to him, throughout. Okay? And also the children of Jahsh ibn Riyab, al-Asad al-Huzaymi, who was the husband of Umama bint Abdul Muttalib, okay, who was, of course, the sister of the Rasulullah's father, right? So, and probably most famous to all of you would be Zainab bint Jahsh, right? So there's the relationship, okay? And so Umama was very close to Rasulullah and as was her husband. And so they were very close to Rasulullah and in close connection, relationship, and an ally also. And so all of their children also, were also very close to Rasulullah. And all of them accepted Islam, by the way. Abdullah ibn Jahsh, you'll hear about him in Hadith. When you read the books of Hadith, you're going to be seeing his Hadith in many instances. And he was named, they say, after the father of Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was named after the father of Muhammad, Abdullah, as he passed away. So he was the namesake. And Ubaydullah, radiallahu anhu, he was a Christian actually before Islam. One of the few of the Arabs of Makkah who actually, as we say, tanasara, accepted Islam, like Warqa ibn Nawfal. So he marries Ramla, better known as Habiba bint Abi Sufyan. So here is, Sufyan ibn Harb, the other Sufyan, okay? Who they also went with in both hijras. They were both, or maybe the first. But in any case, they were in Ethiopia, in Habasha. And there, Ubaydullah passed away, which leaves Ramla Habiba a widow. And consequently, Rasulullah himself marries her. Okay? And then, of course, Zainab radiallahu anha, who, by the counsel of Rasulullah married to Sayyidina Zayd radiallahu anha. And this was a marriage that unfortunately didn't work, but we probably shouldn't even say unfortunately, because it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wisdom that this should take place, which highlights things. Number one, that why Rasulullah was adamant that Zainab should marry Zayd. Number one, because Zayd was a very pious and good Muslim, which is the first thing we should look for in a spouse. Secondly, the concept of classes, the concept of racial, equality, inequality, all of that stuff, which still, the Western world has not been able to come to grips with. So Rasulullah, as he has prolifically said in many occasions, لا فضل العربي على العجمي ولا فضل الأبيض على الأسود إلا بتقوى. So there's no distinction and no elevation or status, elevation or lowering of status because of ethnicity or color or otherwise. And so Nabi also wanted to graphically, and tactically demonstrate that by marrying Zainab, who was, top of the line of in terms of heredity in from Quraysh and nobility, Shafa, as they say, to Sayyidina Zayd, who was a freed slave, which seemed to be on the bottom of the social status, in Meccan society. However, it didn't work. And this also, so on the one hand, we have Rasulullah as an idealist and showing this ideal, but on the other hand, human beings are not machines. They are human beings. They have emotions and they have feelings and they have preferences and they have likes and they have what we call melan, attractions and disattractions. And so Zainab was just totally, unattracted to Zayd. And it was, she just couldn't, come to grips with being married to such an individual. And she would recognize his piety and his high status. She said, but as far as my emotions and my human feelings, I just can't. This is too much. So ultimately, even though Nabi tried his best to keep that marriage intact, but obviously, since it wasn't working out, and at a time when women, they didn't have any rights anyway, and then on top of that, whether you like the husband or not, so you basically are his property. That's how it was all over the world in those days. So again, this is another point highlighted here. So since it's not working out, so Islam says if it's not working out, you don't force it. If it is not working out, then you take separate paths. And if they depart, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guarantees that He will grant each party, from His treasuries and from His unlimited resources. Okay? So that's one thing. Then the third thing, which was the most, sort of, we say in Arabic, Amat al-Kubra. It was the biggest joke, probably, that Nabi was ordered to actually marry Zainab. Now, there's a lot talk, the Orientalists, they have a lot to say about this, that Nabi saw Zainab. And he grew up with Zainab. That was his, he'd seen her since her childhood. There was nothing like this. So the whole idea was, as we mentioned, your biological parents cannot be anyone except your biological parents. Regardless of how much you care for them or whatever. Biologically, that's the blood relationship is something which you can't create or shift or pass on, really. Now, if you want to take, if you want to take the responsibility for orphans and raise up people, that's a wonderful thing to do. And Nabi Sallallahu mentioned that the person who looks after an orphan, he and I will be like that in paradise. But it doesn't mean you're going to be his father, you're going to be his mother, which means that also all those ahkam of mahramiyya and all these things, who's marriage and inheritance and who we can mix with and have, be in isolation with and all, and travel with and all these other rules and regulations, they remain, as per status quo. So you can be. It's a very virtuous thing to look after, take responsibility, and raise orphans, but you're not going to become their father or mother. So this was like it is in Western society. I think pretty much it's, if you adopted a child here, your inheritance, everything, he pretty much becomes your child. But in Islam, we don't accept that because he is not biologically the child. Okay. So, this was also prevalent in Arab society. And Zayd radiallahu anhu was known as Zayd ibn Muhammad. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had to, make it crystal clear that this is not on, it's not going to happen. And therefore, Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam was ordered, even though he was reluctant to marry Sayyidina Zainab radiallahu anha, so that this would once and for all be squashed, if you will. Right? Because just as, for someone to marry the wife of his son, so in Arab society, as perhaps even here, I don't know how they look at it, but to marry the adopted, sons or the son's wife would be like, blasphemy of the highest order. So that had to be squashed and that had to be eliminated. That whole concept had to be eliminated. As a result of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ordered Rasulullah to marry Zainab radiallahu anha. Okay. And then last was Hamna. Sayyidah Hamna radiallahu anha, the younger sister of Zainab, who marries Musab ibn Umair, who was one of the most illustrious young sons of Quraysh and one of the most wealthiest. And they used to talk about him that he would, when he would walk in the streets, the people in their houses would know that Musab ibn Umair was walking by because of the fragrance. He had such expensive perfume and the most expensive of dress. I mean, he was like, and when he accepted Islam, subhanallah, Nabi Sallallahu sent him to Medina Munawwara before Hijrah, before he made his own Hijrah, he sent them sort of reconnaissance and also to begin teaching, the new Muslims in Medina. Allahu Akbar. And he used to have 2 rags that he would wear, and that was it. And in Uhud, he was martyred. And he was, if you probably might have heard the story, when he was martyred, there was not sufficient cloth to cover his entire body as a kafan. What do you call the kafan? Shroud. So Nabi Sallallahu, when he saw this, he started to weep. This was that young man who used to, he was, dressing in the highest of possible, highest possible fashion. And this is, how he left this world. So you can imagine his station with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In any case, that was the husband of Sayyidah Hamna radiallahu anha. And so thereafter, after his martyrdom, Talha ibn Ubaidullah, one of the Ashra al-Bashra, he married her. Now Hamna was one of the ones who was also caught up in the ifk, in the slander of Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha. And there were a few of the Sahaba, among them Sayyidina Hassan, the Shair of Rasulullah, some others that got sucked into that fitna. However, Zainab radiallahu anha, who should have been more inclined to that, being that she was in competition, if you will, being one of the wives, but Zainab radiallahu anha remained aloof from any hint of any such thing. In any case, of course, any Sahaba who got sucked into that fitna, they all made very, very sincere tawbah, and Allah may excuse all of them for that. So anyway, so those 4 of the children of Jahsh and the end of Rasulullah Umama, all 4 of them, and in fact I believe that Umama and Jahsh themselves, all of them, they accepted Islam. They all were the very close allies of Rasul throughout. And then we want to just touch on the marriage of the daughters of Rasulullah. So Zainab radiallahu anha, she marries Khadija's favorite nephew, who is, the sister of Khadija, Hala bint Khuwaylid, right? So Hala bint Khuwaylid, her son, Abu As ibn Rabi'ah, radiallahu anhu, who was a very noble, young man in Quraysh in those days. And even though he didn't accept Islam, in the very beginning, but he was still very supportive, something akin to perhaps like Abu Talib. And he never gave, any difficulty to his wife about that or anything, even though he didn't accept Islam until after he was actually caught captive. And then in Badr, later on after Badr, so ultimately he accepted Islam. And at that point, Zainab radiallahu anha was still in Makkah. It's a very long and very harrowing story Perhaps later on, inshallah, we'll be hearing that story a bit later. So that was the husband of Sayyidah Zainab radiallahu ta'ala anha, and ultimately they were joined in Medina after a very harrowing experience, and then she passed away later on. Probably as a result, obviously the time was up that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala appointed her, but apparently from the injuries that she sustained while trying to perform hijrah, she was accosted, and it was a very, we'll go into that when the time comes, inshallah. Then, as for Ruqayya and Kulthum, who ultimately became the wives of Sayyid Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, so proposals came for them from Rasulullah's uncle Abu Lahab, if you remember. So he proposed for his two sons, Urqba and Urtayba. Now it's very interesting that, Abu Lahab, he proposed to the two daughters of Rasulullah, and by this time, of course, Rasulullah had yet to become a Nabi, and he was yet to, invite people to Tawheed, etc. So they were still, in natural, tribal and relationships as relatives, okay, as uncle and nephew, etc. At the same time, even though Rasulullah perhaps initially was not someone who had a lot of money and all that, but ultimately after the marriage of Khadija, then of course his financial position also, was elevated. However, the main thing is that by this time, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as we mentioned, which was the influencing factor why Khadija radiallahu ta'ala mainly proposed to him, because now everybody, in Quraysh sees that Muhammad is, like he's the one who's going to probably become, the chieftain of the clan, even though he never aspired for that, he never even hinted that he's interested in such a position. But because of his honesty, his integrity, his character, everything about him, his whole demeanor, that, everyone is like pointing the finger, he's the one that's, going to be the one, right? And so trying to take advantage of the situation as well, perhaps that also was a factor there. Of course, what happened was that after Rasulullah did receive Nabuwa, and he started inviting to Allah, as you know, that Abu Lahab was one of the strongest adversaries and opponents of Rasulullah to the extent that even one surah, mentioning the curse of Allah upon him, Tabbat yada Abi Lahabi wa tab. So after accepting, after the Nabuwat, so Abu Lahab recites his marriage proposal, which was considered and still is, in traditional cultures, the height of humiliation. To have to break an engagement, and those of us who have lived in more traditional in India, Pakistan, the Arab world, once you have an engagement and you break that engagement, that's called a war almost, pretty much. So that was really that was like 3 slaps in the face. So here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obviously gave them better in any case. So now we come to the last sort of thing that we want to touch on tonight, and that was the rebuilding of the Kaaba, which was an amazing episode. So basically what happened is that obviously since the Kaaba was built, it began from the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and when was the last time that it had been renovated, Allah knows. In any case, it had been weakened over the passage of time. At the same time, just before that, some very severe floods came and weakened the whole structure. And in fact, they mentioned that perhaps cracks were showing in the Kaaba, and the whole edifice might be on the verge of collapse. So Quraysh wanted to rebuild it. Now you can't rebuild it or just repair it. You're going to have to rebuild it altogether, which means you're going to have to take it down, which was a quite foreboding, endeavor. The house of Allah, you're going to tear it down. That's really, a foreboding thing, proposition to consider. So they were very fearful of actually doing that, though the need was very prevalent. So A'id bin Imran, he was a very noble person, and he was also the maternal uncle of Abdullah, the father of Rasulullah. So he said, okay, I'll begin this work. So they say, this is mentioned in Surah Ibn Hisham, he said that when he took out a stone and removed a stone, the stone would fly out of his hand and actually go back into the place. And they said, so this is pretty, what are we going to do about this? So he says, now this is amazing because it just shows you where we are and where these people were, even though they were mushriks. So he said, "O people of Quraysh, use only your best pure wealth. In other words, only use your halal wealth to rebuild this Kaaba. Don't accept the wages of prostitutes. Prostitution was very prevalent. It was part of society. So don't use this, even though they recognize it's a filthy thing to do. But they were doing it. So don't use this. Don't use usury, riba. It's very interesting. So they were even cognizant before the forbidding of riba in Sharia, which is one of the last things that actually was revealed in the Quran in terms of the prohibitions. But it was understood in society that this is a rotten practice, And that's one of the 10 Commandments, by the way. Thou shalt not take usury. And I don't know what the Christians have to say about that, or the Christians or the Jews for that matter, all the bankers. Well, usury, that's interest is something else. Interest is interesting, usury is using, I don't know. But it's all one and the same, whatever you want to call it, It's all one and the same. And also, any illegally usurped money from anyone, any money that has been, allocated unjustly from anyone, don't use any of these funds for building the Kaaba. Now, interestingly, apparently that's why they didn't build the Kaaba on the original foundation. That's why we have that hatim, right? That area that's fenced off, in the backside, from the backside of the two rukuns, Rukun Yamani and Rukun of Hajar al-Aswad. Because they say that they didn't actually come up with enough halal money that wasn't from these type of sources to build it to that extent. And so they built what they could with halal money. Now it's interesting, and we Muslims now, we hear about, taking, interest-based loans to build masajid. Whereas these mushriks wouldn't stoop to such a thing, but we, Allah excuse us, so this is something to reflect on. There's also a lot of interesting, Ibn Hisham mentioned a lot of very interesting things, Wallahu alam bisawab. But for example, one was that there was a fellow that actually, as we mentioned probably earlier, inside the Kaaba there was a well. There was a little beer, a little well. And in that well, they used to, deposit the treasures. The people used to donate and contribute to the Kaaba, gold and silver, whatever, different types of things, And they would put that in there. And so it's mentioned, they mentioned in books of Sirah that, somebody ultimately stole that. And this was also brought further, realization that we have to do something, preserve, make it a little more strong and structured. At the same time, however, they also mention, Ibn Hisham mentions that in that well was a formidable snake who lived in that well, and in the daytime he would come out and he would be on the walls of the Kaaba to sort of prevent anyone from coming nearby, So there was another problem, And then they say that ultimately a big bird flew by one day and just picked him up and took him away. That was the end of that. So now they're free to actually embark on the reconstruction of the Kaaba. So, but still, this is, pulling down the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, demolishing the house of Allah. That was something that, they couldn't get their heads around that, even though they knew they had to do that. So Al-Walid ibn Mughira, he says, okay, I'll be the one who will start. So when he starts, he says, oh Allah, let there not be any fear. Yani la yura. Yani there should be any fear in this matter. We intend only good. We don't mean to break down your house. Oh Allah. So as I mentioned many times, you see, the Arabs, here in the Jazeera, even though they were mushriks, but still they had that close concept, and when push comes to shove, or something was really important, who did they pray to? They prayed to Allah, So as we mentioned, even though they were mushriks, they were probably still around the closest people to Tawheed than any other people. Khair. So he said, so he's sort of, he tells us, Allah that, hey, look, we don't intend anything bad, so don't take us, don't, punish us for this. We're trying to do something good. So then after he starts that, so the rest of the Quraysh said, okay, let's wait and see. So if he makes it through the night and Allah doesn't take care of him and take him out or, do something, then probably that's an indication from Allah that it's okay, we can just go ahead and carry on. So they waited for the night and the next day nothing happened, so they started. Okay. So they're taking down the Kaaba and actually it was very interesting that they gave, because this is such an auspicious endeavor. So all the tribes, they want this honor to be for us. And so they had to be very tactical and they had to be very diplomatic. So they gave section by section to the various tribes, okay, you take care of this. And so all the tribes had various sections that they were concerned with and they would work on. Okay? And then, while they're taking down the Kaaba, finally they get down to the very foundation that Sayyidina Ibrahim had actually laid. And in Surah Ibn Hisham, they mentioned that there was very sharp green stones that were, and when they tried to actually pry those, and they put like a wedge or something like that, and try to pry them apart, they say the whole Makkah started to shake, like, don't mess with this, right? And so they said, okay, leave this, and we'll just build on that foundation. They also mentioned, Surah Ibn Hisham mentioned that they found, during this reconstruction, they found different things written, interesting things they found written on rocks or whatever. So whoever's interested, he can go and see that in Ibn Hisham. Okay, so now they had intended actually, and not simply to redo it, but they also wanted to put a new roof. They wanted to put a proper roof on it, which it didn't really have. And they also wanted to expand the height, double the height. It was just, a little bit over, head span, maybe around 9 to 10 feet or so. So they wanted to double the height. And they also wanted to, put a proper wooden roof on it. And they say also that just before that a shipping vessel, was smashed at sea and it was washed up on the shore in Jeddah, and they got that, and when they saw that, they said, okay, this is our roof. So the lumber from that ship became the roof of the Kaaba, at that particular point in time. Okay, now, as I said, so since this is, the building and the reconstruction, all this, there's honor, being, acquired by being involved in this whole process. So every tribe wants to have the maximum amount of this honor for themselves, and you know how that goes. So there was scuffles, all along the way. And then, when it came to the question of placing the black stone, oh, this was really a sensitive issue. And like, who's going to do this? We're going to. And so what happened was, so Bani Abdullah and Bani Adi, they swore, as we said earlier, they brought the blood and they put their hands in it and they swore that we're going to fight to the end. So we're going to do this, So this is, so now they're at this impasse, and 4 or 5 nights passes, and it's like they're just on the verge of killing one another over this, over this issue. And then ultimately they resolve to settle the matter, there in the masjid, there next to the Kaaba. So the eldest of Quraysh, and his name was Abu Umayyah ibn al-Mughira, he gives a section. They said that he was the eldest of Quraysh at that particular time. So he said, okay, I've got a solution. What is it? The first person who enters into the masjid, they're sitting there in the masjid, the first person who enters into the masjid from that door, we're going to give him arbitration to this issue. So that's an arbitrary thing. It's just showing any favor. It's just whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends in that door, then we're going to make him the arbitrator. They said, okay, that's fair. That's good. We like that. So, who's the first to enter? Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And now, when everybody sees this Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam enters, they said, okay, fine, wonderful, right? هذا محمد هذا الأمين الذي نرتضي قضاءه وحكمه. That is Muhammad. He's the trusted one. We are content. We're totally satisfied with his judgment. And not only that, but Rasulullah came up with a novel way of settling the issue. He said, okay, get a big, sort of like a sheet, a cloth, and what we'll do is every tribe will take a side of that, a corner, maybe the sides, or however many tribes there were, everybody get a hold of that sheet, and all the tribes will lift up the sheet, which the black stone is going to be placed in the middle of it. All of the tribes together will lift the black stone up, and the Nabi with his own Mubarak hand put the black stone into its place. So on the one hand, Rasulullah had solved this issue. Secondly, it also highlights how already they felt, his status and their contentment, to place him in a position of total authority and supreme authority within themselves. At the same time, it also, having been the one to have placed the black stone into its place, it also further elevates the status of Rasulullah, all of which he had nothing to do about. It was all the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so that's what we wanted to discuss tonight, to continue, inshaAllah ta'ala, wa sallallahu sallam ala sayyidina Muhammad ala abdihi wa rasulihi sayyidina Muhammad alayhi salatu wa salam. And if there are any questions or comments or something, let them come forward. Any questions, comments? What about online? Was there any online people? Was there any online people? Anyone? No? So, Jazakumullah khair, Barakallahu feekum, may Allah bless you all for coming. Yeah.
Was it the stone that comes in the corner of the Kaaba?
Yeah. And also, Ibn Hisham mentions an interesting thing about the black stone. The tradition has it that it came from Jannah, right? Allahu alam. In any case, Ibn Hisham mentions that Ibrahim alayhi salam, when doing tawaf, he would sometimes forget, how many times he's actually, gone around it, and you have to go around 7 times, right?
That's the starting point.
So he also realized, if I'm having a problem, then people who come after me, they're going to have a problem too. So we need some solution for that. So in the meantime, Jibreel alayhi salam, according to this riwayah, this narration, Jibreel alayhi salam comes with the black stone and says, okay, here's your solution. And so keep this, and though that's where, from that point we start, from that point we end. So, yeah.
I wanted to ask, because I remember hearing way back in a lecture, and I might have misheard it, but I remember it being mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ didn't really like to be called by his kunya Abul Qasim. Is that correct or no?
Well, actually, at one point he forbid it. Don't call me by, or don't call somebody else, not actually him, but don't call somebody else by his kunya. That's actually what he was saying. And the reason for that was that the Rasulullah was in the marketplace, and somebody actually called him Ya Abul Qasim, and he was actually calling somebody else. And so Nabi Sallallahu heard that, and so he, okay, yeah, what do you want? So he said, actually, I didn't mean, I meant, so he said, Sammu bismi wa la takannu bi kunyati. Use my name, but don't use my kunya, because that's loss for him. So they say that that's, obviously, if we look at the situation that brought about the context of that, was it actually a prohibition, or it's like, it's not a good idea to do that? Probably it's more like makruh than like haram. In any case, obviously, if we look at the context, that would be while the Rasulullah is alive, when he's not, after his demise, then there would be an issue. And we know that the kunya Abul Qasim has been used in many of our illustrious ulama, so, okay. Right? So, but obviously, a Muslim would not call Rasulullah by his kunya, he would call him Ya Rasulullah. Right? But Sahaba in third person narrations would say, Sami'tu Abul Qasim sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So there's no actual karaha in between that. Yeah.
So, the Utbah and Utayba, they were just engaged to the two daughters of the Prophet ﷺ. They were not married.
What's that?
The two daughters of the Prophet ﷺ who were engaged to Abu Lahab's son.
Yeah.
It was just engagement. It was
Just engagement. Yeah. Yeah.
Second question, I don't know. I wanted to ask you how true it is that they say the black stone is getting darker and darker because of the sins of the people who kiss it?
That's said. They said it was originally when it came from Jannah, it was white. And because every time the people like me go by with so many sins and touch it or kiss it, those sins, blacken it. It's said. Wallahu a'lam.
But in time of Prophet ﷺ, it was still called black stone, right?
Yeah. So obviously it was black at that time. And between that time and Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam was quite a long time past. So okay, I'll give you that's a research for you. So come up with look at the Torah for that and see do we have any substantial riwayat that actually, but basically what I recall is it's said like this. Wallahu a'lam. So you can look around and see if you can find out something about that. Anything else? Anything else?
One last question.
Yeah.
You said that like the incident of the if, and you said that people were sucked into it. Did you mean like they were supporting the rumor?
In other words, because when we get to it, because we're going to cover that in detail when we get to it. That's obviously in the Madani period, but it was, and it was such. And then when we see, to what extent was the impact of that fitna, and that's why qadh is a heinous crime, because at this point it almost came to the point where Aus and Khazraj were about to again engage in war, because and it was it's initiated by Abdullah ibn Ubay, the chief of the Munafiqs. So it was an effort of the Munafiqs, as Munafiqs will always endeavor to do, plant the seeds of rancor and fitna. And so when fitna comes, a lot of people get sucked in, And perhaps what they mention is that perhaps Hamna was got also perhaps a dimension of her getting sucked into that was in sort of in a kind of well wishing for her sister, if you follow my point, right? Right. So, however, Zainab would have nothing to do with it, would listen to it. But in any case, in the case of Mistah, the relation of Abu Bakr also got stuck into that, and as a result, Abu Bakr cut off his expenditure that he used to give to him on a monthly or whatever basis, and then he swore that I won't give him it because he was involved in that, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accosted him for that. وَلَا يَأْتَلِ أُولِي الْفَضْلِ مِنْكُمْ وَالسَّعَةِ أَنْ يُؤْتُوا أُولِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينَ وَالْمُهَاجِرِينَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَلْيَعْفُوا وَلْيَصْفَحُوا. So don't swear that you're not going to do good things. Do good things. People make mistakes. They made tawbah. And if anybody was actually, and whoever was actually, was complicit, directly complicit, they were lashed. That was the end of that. And so once, ta'ib min ad-dam kaman la dhanba lahu, a person who repents from his sin is like the one who has committed no sin. And obviously, such type of things had to take place as a lesson for the generations to come later, so that we can see to what extent are these, what's the impact of such type of of social evils, and this qadh, this slander of the chaste women, this is a terrible thing, or chaste men for that matter as well. So is that clear? Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Barakallahu feekum, subhanakallah bihamdika, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu